You have a question, we have an answer. This is Jane Muller.
And this is Ken Muller. Welcome to our show, all about real estate with Ken and Jane. Today, we are rejoined with David Greek. He's the Managing Director of Greek Development and the Chairman of Circulate, New Jersey. David, big welcome back to our show.
Thanks for having me back.
You're quite welcome. So last week, we touched upon Circulate New Jersey and how that coalition is trying to get out the word about all the benefits and the good things that logistics brings to New Jersey. And we mainly spoke about the economic driving force. So let's talk a little bit about what the brownfields remediation and how they're really changing the game with the environmental restoration. So first off, we should start off by, people are probably wondering, what the heck is a brownfield?
Yeah. A brownfield is kind of what it sounds like. So there's a greenfield and a brownfield, and development of greenfield is really land that has little to no history of industrial use and has no environmental contamination present. They often are either virgin forests or farmland or something like that. The bulk of development in New Jersey, especially over the last 10 years, has fallen into the brownfield category, which typically means there's some sort of environmental contamination on the site, or at the very least, a long history of environmental use that may cause investigation for environmental contamination. New Jersey is, as we talked about in the last program, our location really has dictated our economy for the last 300 years. And so we have been one of the first industrialized states in the nation and one of the fastest industrialized states. And our history here is a lot longer than most other industrial markets in the country. Environmental laws in particular really didn't become that strict in the U.S. until the late 70s, early 80s. And so the bulk of New Jersey industrial history sits well before those laws were in place. And what we've learned about how to protect the environment over the last 50 years, right? We didn't know that when a lot of these really intensive industrial operations were operating here, particularly around the start of the 1900s, where industrialization really peaked in New Jersey. We had a lot of oil refining, we had a lot of manufacturing, we had textile industry here. I think manufacturing has obviously since declined, but the legacy of that still lives on in terms of what the damage that they did to the local water, local air, and the ground. And so this is something that is part of life when you're developing in New Jersey. You have to understand environmental. You have to understand how to remediate it. It's one thing in the context of Circulate that we felt we really needed to spend a lot of time highlighting for the public, because a lot of this is done behind the scenes. What the public sees, in most part, is the site plan application. And that's really where they have the ability to kind of show up and say their piece and really, protest an application if they want. A lot of the environmental work happens well before that, and it often happens, frankly, behind closed doors because there's not as much of a public process. It's more dictated by the science of how to remediate and the physical limitations of how to remediate. But New Jersey has, I think, the strictest, if not top 3 strictest environmental rules in the country. So we're not, by any measure, cutting any corners environmentally in this state. We abide by some of the strictest remediation standards, and that, again, is part of life, being a developer in New Jersey. But a lot of the concerns we were seeing were around the environmental impacts of our projects. And, to me, there was a big dislocation between the environmental benefits we're bringing through remediating brownfields and some of the complaints about maybe the potential environmental damage that these projects could do in the long run.
Right. And I guess what would be some of the concerns that residents would have, because you're taking over this brownfield site? True, there is some money. I guess there's funding. I guess you work in conjunction with the DEP and with the NJEDA, and they have a big $50 million per year tax incentive program, and that's all great that the state helps out as they should, the developers. But I can't imagine. It seems like you're taking a contaminated site that could cost millions of dollars to remediate. And I guess what is the concern residents have, that you're going to have the runoff from the silt built is going to affect you're cleaning it up and basically you're restoring the groundwater. You're restoring, so that's going to.
The most common concern we hear about new buildings is around the traffic it creates. And particularly the trucks, right? So I think from an environmental perspective, people are worried about being exposed to diesel fumes and idling trucks and the increased traffic. And, from a social perspective, people don't like seeing trucks on their streets. Mm-hmm. This is part of what's really important to me in chairing Circulate is that we try to be honest with the public. We try not to sweep issues under the rug, and we try and share real data that we can, have faith that it is real and it's not extrapolated. It is frustrating sometimes maintaining that stance because our peers that are often, the advocacy groups that are often putting out information that is not helpful to our industry do not follow the same rules. And so often we will see, particularly some environmental advocacy groups, take a single fact and kind of spin it into a story about our industry that makes new projects look worse for the economy or worse for the local environment. But when we dig into the facts behind that story, they're pretty flimsy, or they're not even saying anything close to what the organization putting that information out has extrapolated. This has been a big problem for a long time, but particularly now with so many people being online and being able to share content over Facebook, these things can go viral very quickly. And once something becomes viral and becomes shared enough, it kind of becomes truth to the public. So
it's like the perception, they keep spitting it out enough times to
exactly
believe it, right? And I was just thinking when you're going through that discussion about the environmental coalitions, are there any environmental coalitions that you guys can perhaps liaison with that would see the forests for the trees and say that, hey, these guys are taking, like we said off air, you're taking mostly sites that are brownfields that are freaking contaminated and you're restoring them. Aren't there some? Are there any?
Yeah, there absolutely is. I do not want to categorize environmentalists as the enemy here because they're not.
So maybe there's some that say, hey, you guys are actually, you know what, you're doing a good thing here because you're taking those contaminated sites and you're cleaning them up. You're cleaning the groundwater. The groundwater spreads everywhere. You're cleaning the soil, so you're going to help the wildlife and whatever's around there, and it's going to create a win-win.
Exactly.
So
I think the more realistic,
maybe you can have some coalitions or some roundtables in the future with certain environmental groups, so they can help see your side, and not to say that they're going to but at least say, hey, these guys are good for us.
Leave alone the deep environmental thing, right? We live in East Brunswick, right? So, we drive through Heartland because you know what? Recently, I drive more Heartland because township moved the construction office in Heartland. So every time my client did something or not doing anything,
right
next to our office,
I have to go there to fill in the application, a form, whatever, lodge the permit application. So every time, it used to be, right, there is an area, it's not nice to mention who they are, but there was an area, but it's really not, I'm not saying they have an environmental issue, right? Just the feeling.
They do. They do because they do.
You know what? Ken, I'm not going there, right? I'm not expert. I'm just a residential realtor. Right. I'm not going there. But in the heart of East Brunswick, and when you're driving past that field, especially when you're passing the Heartland, turn left, that's Apple Ridge, which is a very high-end housing.
Yes.
Just right there, right?
Yep.
So I always wondered, because that's been that since I came to East Brunswick like 20 years ago. It's always,
I think that junkyard's been there for well over 50 years. And it's something, when my father moved down to East Brunswick, he approached the owners about buying it. They weren't ready to sell. We've been looking at that junkyard for a half a century at this point. Wow. And we were lucky enough to acquire a portion of it about 10 years ago and be able to redevelop it and remediate the environmental damage that had been done there from the previous use. Storing old cars on a site
is going to be indicative of hydraulic oils. And
you got things leaking. Those are old cars that, they get into the soil. It gets into the groundwater. It's hard to clean up. It's expensive to clean up. We use the NJ Brownfields program on that cleanup, and it helps offset a portion of the cost, but only a portion.
That's right.
And Look, honestly, the building we built is very, very close to our headquarters, and I get to drive past it pretty much every day, and I'm very proud of it because it is a beautiful property.
Beautiful,
even
gorgeous.
Hart's Lane looks, it's like 120% improvement. I mean, they have green grass, you have nice orderly buildings.
Yes, landscaping.
Landscaping is, and I have to say, even with your buildings, the landscaping is always top. You always have a lot of trees, a lot of nice islands.
Thank you.
And they're painted on the outside. They look very presentable. So how long did that particular remediation take, or is it still ongoing?
It finished, that project itself finished, I think, about 8 or 9 years ago, and the remediation took place mostly before the building was built because most of it had to do with cleaning up the soils and a little bit of containment of groundwater. But just as an example, we love the NJ Brownfields program. It's really helpful. But the way that the program works is we really had to spend the money up front and then get reimbursed.
Right.
So it was, we were taking a significant amount of risk when we went in and spent the money to remediate the property, assuming that, first of all, the Brownfields program would be around long enough for us to be reimbursed, which thankfully it has. But it also took, quite a bit of know-how and quite a bit of capital up front to be able to do that. And what ultimately unlocked the site for us was finding the right tenant who could go there, and that we could justify spending some of that money up front because we knew we had a tenant to fill that space. That's a common story for environmentally contaminated sites, and one of the reasons why we have been able to remediate more in the past 5 or 6 years, and most of the industry has as well, is just the values and the rents have increased to a point where spending that money up front now makes sense. And there's enough value in the land and in the leasehold interest to be able to take that risk and spend all that upfront capital and very, very risky capital to be able to do that.
Right, absolutely. Yeah. All right, we're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back after these messages. Okay, welcome back. So, David, let's continue talking about some brownfield remediation. Would you like to share with us on one of the particular sites that you're very fond of having cleaned up?
And like I said, I think almost everything we're doing right now involves some sort of environmental remediation. But I think the one that kind of checks all the boxes and that is close to finishing actually is our large project in Linden. The Linden Logistics Center, to give a 30-second background on the project, we acquired it around 2018. It's about a 4 million square foot, 8-building park located in Linden, New Jersey, in northern New Jersey. We are starting our final phase, our last building there, hopefully soon. The industrial history of the site is fascinating and really speaks to a lot of what I was saying in the previous segment about the history of New Jersey. So the use of this site goes back to the late 1800s. There was rail running to the site, and they would basically import a whole bunch of buffalo carcasses by rail and strip them and grind down the bones and export those bones as phosphate for fertilizer. And it was under that use for about 30 years until the 19-teens, 1920s, when it was, that business was shut down and it was acquired by a chemical dye company. That company eventually became Chemours, which eventually was bought by Dow DuPont. So it's become a very large conglomerate. At the time, and we talked about this a little earlier before about environmental laws not really coming into place until much later in the century, the method for disposing of the chemicals used in dyes was, and this is, you can find a Popular Mechanics magazine from the 1950s and still see this in there. You dig a hole, you fill it with grout, and you pour the dye down the hole, right? So you can imagine the damage that does to both the groundwater and the soils on the site. Those chemicals last a very, very long time, right? That's kind of the purpose of the chemical dye. So they don't go away. They don't naturally attenuate in any way. And the amount of time that this facility was in operation, close to 60 years, that's a lot of material going into the ground.
Wow.
Additionally, a portion of the site was used starting in the 1950s by the GAF, the large roofing manufacturer, and this site was actually one of the largest manufacturers of shingles in the entire country for a very long time. That use is not clean either. Shingles have, several petroleum products that go into them. Again, this was during the 50s, 60s, 70s, so prior to a lot of the regulation coming in place as how to dispose of that. that also went into the ground and the groundwater. The site was shut down basically in the late 80s because of the level of contamination that had occurred there. And basically the state said to those companies, you cannot continue to employ people on this site unless you clean it up. So they shut down the sites. They sat vacant as just vacant land for over 30 years.
Wow.
Okay.
When we came into the project and I met with the current mayor of Linden, his father had actually worked at those plants. These plants had been the largest employers in town for almost a century. And so when they shut down and went vacant for 30 years, it directly correlated to kind of a local recession.
Yeah.
And that was still ongoing when we came into the town. They were starting to revive a little bit of the industry in the town and the housing in the town, but they really needed more jobs in order to really have that town take off. And the mayor actually ran on the platform of we need to bring jobs and we need to reactivate some of this land that we haven't been able to. So it was really important. It was a priority of the administration. Thankfully, we had two very large companies as sellers on the other end. And why I say thankfully there is because they had really taken their responsibility environmentally here quite seriously and started to do a lot of the work that was required to help us eventually build out the site. So some of that work, for example, included containing the groundwater within the site. And that is, one of the tricky parts about remediating groundwater is it doesn't stay where you want it to, right? Water flows wherever it wants. It doesn't know where property lines are.
Sure.
In order to solve that physical problem, basically a large underground bathtub was built around the site to contain the groundwater. There was active pumps within the system to make sure that water stayed within the system and didn't sneak outside of that wall. And that system is still in place today. We have finished, basically building over top of it, but that underground system to contain and treat and monitor groundwater is still there. Additionally, and we were part of the effort to finish this up, we imported a lot of fill to the site. And this is actually really interesting and nuanced. We imported the fill in order to get the elevation of the site above the floodplain. And we imported close to, on average, about 14 feet across the entire site.
Wow.
So a lot of dirt came into the site. One benefit is because the site was so dirty, we were actually able to take some other people's dirty dirt and put it on our site because it matched the contaminants. And then when our final solution to that contamination is really to encapsulate all of that dirt with underneath our development, whether that's in concrete or pavement or clean topsoil, we were able to kind of recycle some dirt that couldn't be used elsewhere because of the contaminants in it that matched ours, and then encapsulate that within our development and cause it to be removed from interaction with the public.
I was going to think that you're going to have to remove massive amounts of dirt, but what you did is, as you explained, is you kept all that dirt. They know it's dirty. The whole site is dirty, but you just put this massive encapsulation around
exactly.
it, 14 foot or whatever, however many feet as a barrier, right? Because a lot of times when there's contamination, you dig and then you remediate. You put it with certified clean fill, but that would have been you would still be digging.
But where are you going to?
We had to dig 100 feet down. And
so what do you do with this? You digged out.
Correct, and there's nowhere you got to put.
Exactly.
So right, so that's smart. Okay, so and it was about a 14-foot high certified clean fill went above it.
That's right. Yeah.
Wow.
And there was a lot of other factors to the site besides environmental. We actually built a bridge over a rail line and an active roadway in order to access the site, as well as a lot of infrastructure within the site. So environmental, I think, was a big piece, but just one piece of making that development successful. Ultimately, though, I think the impact on the local community is so immense. I mean, I don't want to take credit for being, more sophisticated or better at this than anyone else. I think the story was we were in the right place at the right time, with the right price and the right team to execute. But that is the story from a Circulate perspective, right? It's not just Greek real estate partners doing this. This is how our industry develops in New Jersey. we have to look at these sites that have these long histories and might have 30 years of vacancy because they're untouchable environmentally. We have to figure out creative solutions like the one I just talked through to get them back into production. We have to do that as developers and landlords because that's the only land we have available here. Yeah. But from a local community perspective, if we just think through the Linden example, the largest employer in town, forced to shut down for 30 years, and what that does to the local economy. The only ability to really recover from that is recovering that land and making that land productive again. The vast majority of the time, not every time, but the vast majority of the time, the key to unlock that is industrial development. It is the way, the values are there. We can afford to pay for this remediation. We know that we can, because the contamination is often from previous industries, it means the location is pretty good for an industry, right? So we're taking these kind of historically well-known, well-used locations that are just not usable because of contamination and reimagining them into something that's leasable and good for the local communities, both environmentally and economically.
Right.
And also today's industry, right? Even the industry is more environmental friendly.
Absolutely.
Like a pharmaceutical is a very high tech and a very clean.
Well, same with dry cleaners. Yeah. Everybody's evolved because they want to protect the employees and the owners of the dry cleaners. They evolve because they have to, but also they're concerned about their own health effects for them and their employees.
Yeah.
So everybody's not using those nasty dry cleaning chemicals, the TCEs anymore.
Yeah.
So it's everything's evolving because we all learned. Everybody's educated. Like
our tenants and occupiers pay a lot more attention to their impacts on the site. But I'd say one of the biggest changes over the last 10 years is actually on the investment side. Our investors care about environmental protection too, and creating some aspects of the buildings that ensure that we're not adding to an environmental problem and that we're actually helping create an environmental solution. And one thing New Jersey's done that I applaud is really create an infrastructure for ensuring that when new industrial buildings are built, that they're, quote, solar ready, which means there's enough structure there to be able to put solar panels on the roof and produce electricity. We need to produce more electricity in this state. We're about to experience quite a meaningful rate hike in electric because we don't produce enough here. And we have millions, if not billions, of square feet of rooftop space that could be unlocked to produce electricity. So again, not something the public necessarily sees. You can't see our rooftops from the street. Right. So when we have solar up there and it's producing and it's being sold into the community solar program, which is going directly to those residents, we often just don't get the credit because nobody sees us doing it. It's just another way that these facilities can bring environmental benefits to the communities.
Right. Free energy from the sun when the best places, the rooftops of the warehouses flat and they're ideal. They capture all the sunlight and then they, like you said, they regenerate it to the excess to the towns and the needed communities. So that's just all a big game changer.
The bulk of the pollution from warehousing today comes from the vehicles coming in and out of them, right? And I'd say one thing that isn't talked about enough is the advancements in those vehicles.
Yes.
One thing that has caused a lot of public confusion is there's a desire from this administration here in New Jersey, as well as many people within the Senate Assembly, to move towards an electric truck fleet.
Right.
And there's been some conversation about trying to do that by, say, the year 2035. There's a lot of reasons why that isn't going to happen. Primarily, we don't have the electrical infrastructure to be able to charge those trucks,
and they would need
for example.
Massive charge. We're talking about, forget about a car that you can go from here to New England and have one of those superchargers, but I can imagine the time it would take to charge a truck, and if it's got to go from New York to California.
It's a lot of power. This is a bit of stale data, but anecdotally, we did a power study on one of our sites to be able to power an electric truck fleet. The amount of draw that it would have been basically the equivalent to the entire city of Elizabeth
Wow.
for one facility, right? So we have a generation problem, we have a transmission problem, we have an infrastructure problem that's going to make it really, really hard to accomplish electrification of all trucks in New Jersey by 2035. Not that that's not a worthy goal, but you're kind of missing the mark on that policy initiative. If you look at some of the improvements that have been made to the diesel engine over the last 10 years, clean diesel is incredibly efficient. And I won't say it's good for the environment.
It's probably 90% cleaner than it was 30
I think
ago,
even
20 years
higher
ago.
than that.
Even higher than that,
95, 99% more efficient, less contaminants. It really, that technology has come a long way and it isn't getting as much attention as some of the sexier hydrogen or electric vehicles. But that's what our tenants are adapting now. And that is a really, really good benefit to local communities. And really, I think if the public understood that technology and how clean it is and how well it operates, some of the concerns around exposure to
diesel fumes,
right? That would be a little bit less.
Yeah, well said. Unfortunately, we are out of time, but we want to thank you very much for returning again, taking time out of your busy schedule to be our special guest for the second show. All right, thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you guys next week. Have a good one.
Thank you.
Thank you.